And we are so glad to have him. Amazing word last night, and we just really appreciate him being with us. So thank you, John Thomas.
Thank you. Love you, man. So good.
Yay. Well, Jesus. Isn't he amazing? This astounding God that has the capacity to fascinate us when our capacity is so small is our eternal treasure and reward. Like that's mind-blowing to me. I love it. Well, talking about trips, let you guys know about something some of you might be interested in. We've been developing relationships in Israel and have been doing some training and equipping there, and really wanting to continue to sow into what's happening in Israel. So in October, we're going to be taking a group to Israel. We'll be releasing some details. We've got some beginning, the dates and that type of thing up on our website, but we're releasing more details here over the next month. We're in the process of working on our itinerary, but one of the things we're doing is this is going to kind of be a prophetic and intercessory tour. So we're finding some of the places that were key to the prophets, such as Elijah, Samuel, different ones that would have keys, and we'll be talking about the prophetic gift and understanding how place and culture affects how you communicate what you hear and what you hear. Because the place that we live in and the culture that we're in really affects the prophetic, and recognizing that and understanding that will help us to be a lot more effective in hearing. But we also want to spend some time praying over Israel and praying for the peace of Jerusalem. So one of the things we'll be doing is doing Sabbath in Jerusalem, and we will go on the Sabbath. We'll walk down to the old city and go on the ramparts up on the walls of the old city, and walk from the Jaffa Gate to the western wall and make prophetic declarations over the city, pray over the city up there. We'll talk a little bit about intercession for Israel. And then be there for sundown at Sabbath at the Western Wall. And if you've never experienced that, it is amazing. Thousands and thousands of people coming and celebrating, getting to worship and pray in the presence of the Lord. And it's I've been there, 7, 8 times I've been to Israel. And the last time I went was the first time I'd experienced that, and it was astounding. So we're going to get to do that. So if you're interested in going to Israel, that's going to be a fun trip. We're going to keep it just a one bus because we want to be able to really connect with the people that go. So whatever we can fit on one bus, and we'll close off the registrations and do another one later. But that's going to be fun. How many of you are familiar with Streams Creative House? Have heard of Streams Creative House or something about it? All right, so about 4 or 5 of you. One of the things that had been on John Paul's heart that triggered something in me, years ago, was this whole understanding of how the creative process and the prophetic process are so intertwined. That both of them are taking something that you have experienced that nobody else has experienced and bringing it into a form so that other people can come into that experience as well. And when we begin to allow creativity to be informed by the voice of God and the presence of God, it has the potential to shift culture. And every culture goes through shifts where they are more creative and less creative. And you can see these broad shifts, more left brain and then more right brain. And but I don't have time to go into that. That could be a whole nother preach if I don't stop. So we're in a shift right now where it seems like we're moving kind of back into a more creative understanding in the Western world, and a value for that and an understanding of that, and the experience being more important than the information in a lot of ways. And so creativity is going to be a very defining thing for how the Western world, and specifically the British Empire, which the U.S. fits into the traditional British Empire, but that influences, we're in a season where creativity over the next couple decades is going to inform the next 50 to 80 years of our culture. And so it's key right now to press in for good creativity, for godly creativity. And you're seeing God releasing seeds into people that's pulling creatives into a kingdom expression. And that is, just the popularity even over the last 10 years of Christian movies and the quality of them that are coming out. And then some of the music that's becoming more and more popular where it has to do with creativity and Christianity. But what happens is creativity is not just about the arts. That when creativity is allowed to expand, it does change the arts, which informs culture. But at the same time, it actually creates inventions and it shifts the culture. We're allowed to rethink things that we thought were one way. We can begin to imagine things being differently. And an explosion of creativity also always comes before major reformation. Because then you have architecture that changes, you have government and laws that change, because we're able to rethink things in a different way. And we've missed some of the deeper aspects of creativity and what that means to shift and to transform the world that we live in. And we've been pressing in to understanding what this looks like and how do we inspire creative intelligence. And so my friend Charity Bowman Webb, who's been one of our streams teachers in Scotland for a number of years, the Lord has given her some understanding on creativity that I have not heard anywhere. And I've been studying this for a couple decades, well, over a decade now. I can't say a couple decades. I've been studying creativity. Over a decade now that this has been something, it's been on my radar that I've been looking at, learning about, listening, reading. And the Lord has given her something really beautiful. And so I've kind of given her a place to head up Streams Creative House. I'm helping to be on the leadership team, but she has something that the Lord is giving her. And so I'm trying to help that grow as much as it can. I want to encourage you just to take a look at what we're doing. We've got a website, Streams Creative House. You can go look at that. There's a Facebook forum where we're starting to get some creativity as well as some information, instruction. And one of the things that we've done over the last few years is explore what does it look like when we allow creativity to make space for the presence of God. If you take a look at the tabernacle of Moses, God gave a very specific format so that something could be created in the earth realm that made room for his presence. That the combination of colors, of smells, and of sounds created an atmosphere that was conducive to the presence of God. How can we do that now? Now, you can't create a physical space that God has to inhabit. That's called witchcraft. If you do something in the natural to get a spiritual result, that is witchcraft. It's the other way around. Something spiritual that gets a natural result. We agree with the spiritual and the physical, but we're not manipulating the spiritual with the physical. That very fine line is the line between relationship with God and witchcraft. But how do we do that, and how do we make space for that? How do we make room for spoken word, for different sounds? Last year at Tabernacle in Scotland, we had a group of classically trained musicians. Some of them been in the London Philharmonic, and they bring their instruments and they just spontaneously play whatever is in the atmosphere. And I had this thought as we were getting started. Everybody has to play an A. So we spent about 5 minutes with 14 different instruments playing A. And just different scales and different tones, but everybody was playing an A. And it brought the whole place into a unity, and something opened up. What happens when we let that draw us into an experience? Too many of us, we get so familiar with the familiar that we refuse to try something new. Now, we hit some stuff last night talking about the fear of man and how when we're afraid of what people are going to think, it begin to hinder our ability to respond to God. We will begin to question the things that we're hearing because that can't really be God because it doesn't make sense to my mind. That can't really be God because it doesn't fit into my culture. It can't really be God because it doesn't fit into my family culture or my church culture or my society culture. Whatever that is, it doesn't fit into the little group of friends that I have. And so we question some of these things. But when God is given the freedom to take us places that are new to us, we find ourselves birthing destiny. Abraham had to go to a place that he didn't know, and he wanted to understand. Well, where is that? You don't know. You just go. Yeah, but where am I going? You don't know. That doesn't make sense. Yes, go. This is normal with God. But we have so exalted the mind where our mind has become God that if we don't understand it, we don't obey. See, whatever you have to check in with before you obey is your real God. So if you have to check in with your understanding before you obey, your understanding is God, not God. Now, I'm not saying, do you know what you're supposed to do? That's different than, I don't really understand what to do. That you need to understand what you're supposed to do. But how is it going to work out? Why? What is it going to do? What's the result of it? Those things, sometimes God He'll give it to us. But sometimes He purposefully doesn't give it to us because if He did, we would truly believe that it really wasn't Him. And so this ability to allow creativity to expand our minds and expand our ways of following God, it's not just this thing so that we can have a neat little picture that tells a prophetic story to somebody, which is a nice thing. That is a good thing, and God uses that. But that's what a lot we've taken spiritual creativity, and that's what we think of when it comes there. But spiritual creativity is why David was inventing instruments, because he had sounds that were being inspired, that there was nothing that could make that sound, so he had to invent new instruments to be able to make the sound that he'd heard in his spirit that hadn't been made into the earth yet. It was the creativity and the explosion of creativity. I think it was it Hezekiah that started having all of these engineering ideas where he was creating aqueducts and he was creating ways of hiding water sources and and moving the water to where it needed to be. And he was even creating new war machines so that he could be protected, so he could protect what God had. That was spiritual creativity. It was spiritual creativity when Jesus spits on the dirt and forms an eyeball and pops it into a blank socket and becomes an eyeball and the person sees. See, it becomes something that is core to our relationship with God. It's what allows us to not get stuck doing what we've always done, getting what we've always got. Because if we continue to do what we've always done, we're going to continue to get what we've always got. And the shifting that's happening in our culture requires us to rethink what church is. But if we can't be creative to respond to something as small as put these two colors together or put these two notes together, then we're not going to be creative enough to respond when God says, I want you to do church differently. Because if you're not faithful in the little things, you'll never be faithful in much. We've been taught in the art of hearing God that our obedience in the little hidden things is what gives us the strength in our spirit to be able to handle the weight of the big things when they come. It's those little things, that little acts of faithfulness, when God prompts us to do something that makes absolutely no sense, that nobody will know about, that doesn't change anything, and we do it simply because it was His prompting, that faithfulness over time actually builds up a stability in our spirit that allows us to handle when God asks us to do something insane to the mind of man. But the wisdom of God has always been insane to man. But we discount it because it doesn't make sense to us. When we get used to doing what is right in the wisdom of man, we miss what's the wisdom of God. How do we get out of it? Give yourself permission to think differently. And not only give yourself permission, command yourself. Tell your soul, you will hear differently, you will see differently, you will be differently. This is not going to be the way that you thought it was. Your capacity and what you've learned so far is not the fullness of who God is. And so you must expand beyond yourself to get into Him. Because until you get out of yourself, you're not getting into Him. Because the self that you're comfortable with is not the fullness of who you actually are. The you that you see when you look in the mirror is not what God sees when He sees you. When He looks at you, He sees the dream that He had before He hung a star in the universe. It says that He knew you. He had experiential knowledge of you before the foundation of the universe. He had a thought, a dream in His heart, a thought in His head that was you, that became you. That is the eternal you, that is the aspect of Himself that He thought worthy enough to put into form so that His glory could be revealed to the cosmos, and He created you to do so. You carry something of Him that nobody else in all of time and all of creation has ever carried. And when you allow Him to come out of you, you actually become yourself and you reveal His glory. But we're so busy doing what we've done that we can't become who we are. We get so busy because it's not familiar. It's not comfortable. We had a breakout at our church when I was pastoring up in Boston. And the Lord just, we ended up going 7 or 8 nights, every single night. We saw every miracle that you can imagine in a week's time. Our meetings, we'd start at 7 o'clock. People would be getting there at 5 and 5:30, and sometimes wouldn't be leaving until 2 o'clock in the morning. After 7 nights, that was enough of that for a while. We were just worn out, but God did these amazing things. We had this guest speaker that had come in that had opened this thing up, and we saw this stuff begin to explode. And he was telling me how I needed to have our worship leader play more familiar songs, because it'd be easier for the people to follow along. I'm so glad I did not listen to that wonderful sage advice, because we're not trying to get people to respond the way they responded the last time. We're trying to get people to respond to God. I am is not the I was. It's really hard to encounter God the way that you encountered him yesterday, because he is now. But we create these monuments to the experiences of our past. We have these encounters with God, and we begin to equate God, we begin to equate ourselves, and we get stuck in these patterns because God did something powerful. He did something real. And we end up just like Peter on the Mount of Transfiguration. We're seeing the glory, we're seeing Moses, we're seeing Elijah, and we're like, hey, let's build tents. This is amazing. We got in this encounter. We're going to build tabernacles. We're going to memorialize this. Let's stay here forever. And Jesus says, no, let's go back down the mountain. Something else to happen. But a generation later, the church builds a chapel. You can go visit it. On the Mount of Transfiguration, exactly where Jesus said not to build a chapel. Because we always want to memorialize what God was, because we don't have enough faith for the God who is. When we allow creativity to explode in our hearts, it gives us that faith so that it becomes easier and easier for us to follow. You allow those promptings that take you out of what you're used to, out of what is norm, and you begin to follow those things. You're not doing something different because it's different. That's how we get weird Christians. You don't want to do something different just because, oh, I'm creative, I'm doing something different now. No, it's got to be the inspiration of what God is doing. But the question is, have you allowed yourself to think differently so that when he tells you something that doesn't fit into your grid, that you'll actually follow, that you'll actually listen? But because if not, you'll get to repeat what the church has done in the last season. They say that the people that persecute revivals the most are the ones that were from the last revival. Because what's happening doesn't fit what was. I love how far back do I want to go to make sure you guys can follow my thought process? Give me 2 seconds to make sure that there's a connection point so I don't lose you. David said in Psalm 119 that because I meditate on your law more than any of my teachers, I've advanced, I'm wiser than all of them. There's something about understanding the law that gives you spiritual principles that takes you places that you can't go in any other way, and understanding what it really is. That principle of the old thing killing the new thing, that is, don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Don't boil the new thing. Don't kill the new thing by the elementary teachings of the last thing. The milk of the word, it's the basic, the elementary teachings. But we always want to take the milk that we learned in the last season and use it to kill the new thing that God has birthed. Don't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Don't use what you learned in the last move of God to ignore the next one. The problem with a river is it's always changing. If you build a tent, an altar on the side of the river, it will never see what was again. Because it's already passed, it's already gone. And we stay waiting for what was, missing what's the future. Now, there's a place where we have to accept what was to be able to step into the future. And there is a place where we actually hold on to certain things while others move into a new thing. Jesus says that you don't put new wine into old wineskins lest they burst and the wine gets spilled out. You put new wine into new wineskins. And we repeat that one a lot. But one of the Gospels, he adds this little phrase that we miss. No one having drunk the old wine says the new wine is good. Any of you guys drink wine? A few of you. Okay, so I don't personally, but I do a lot of ministry in Europe, so I've got a lot of friends that do. And I've learned some things about wine. One of the things that I've learned about wine is new wine isn't good. It takes time for wine to mature. The old wine is better. If you let it mature, it begins to develop nuances of flavor. It begins to grow in its capacity. You get more layers. It's richer. It's deeper. It loses some of the bitterness, and it gets smoother over time as you allow it to mature, as you allow it to grow. But if you are a vineyard and you get this amazing crop of wine, and you say, okay, that's it. All we're going to do is wine from 2020. This is the best crop of wine ever. We only have 2020. 2021 grapes are not good enough. We're going to keep this wine. Sooner or later, you're going to run out of wine and you've got nothing left. You've always got to keep the new wine and the old wine so that there's a continual flow, and both have to be in the same house. Or else the house will no longer have a place where anybody would come to get something from it. So you actually have to allow a place for something new to come without judging the old. Because if you've tasted the old, you're not going to look at the new and say, wow, that's really good. You're going to say, wow, that's really immature. But that new wine has to have a new wineskin that it fits in. But we want it to fit into the old wineskin so that it makes sense in the house. Is this making sense? How can we develop the place where we allow them both to grow up together? That the new wine no longer is rejecting the old wine because it's old and it's past its days, and it's fading away. Sooner or later, it's going to be gone, and there's no more of it, which is true. Now, how does the old wine not look at the new wine and say, but you're obviously not as mature. Why don't you we've already got good wine. Just do it this way. It's so much smoother. It's so much easier. It's so much richer. There's more to it. If we allow both to grow up, now you're not going to be able to let both grow up if you do not have a value for creativity. Because without creativity, all you do is repeat what you've always done. You just keep on repeating. And you keep on repeating. There's been... But I'm hitting different points. I planned on talking about how to foster prophetic ministry in a local church. The notes are there. Oh, well. So we'll just follow this flow for a while. And keep an eye on the time. I've got 22 minutes. Okay. I have a friend that is a media ecologist. An interesting form of study. medium, it's forms of communication. Ecology is the way it changes over time and affects society. And so his study is how the medium, the normal way of learning, affects what we learn and how we learn. And you can look over the history of the world at some major changes in media. The first one was the invention of the alphabet. Before there was an alphabet, there were pictures, and pictures communicated thoughts and concepts. They did not communicate sounds. But then there was this shift where we began to develop written language where those pictures became more forms, and those forms come together actually was allowed us to write words instead of just painting stories. And that began to shift how we learned, because it was easier for us to keep hold of information, and it was easier for us to anchor information and keep it consistent instead of the flow that happens when there's story that's given to generation to generation to generation to generation. Guess the group of people that was alive in the generation after the invention of the alphabet. Well, I give you a major leader's name. His name was Moses. And he comes up with these things, in Hebrew is literally called the 10 words. And he wrote. The alphabet wasn't invented in Egypt. They were still using pictures. It was invented in Midian. The Ugaritic peoples that was influencing that. And so he has to go out of Egypt so he could go to a place where there's a new form of communication, because it would allow him to be able to do what God wanted to do. And then God brings a revelation, because now a new medium is introduced that allows there to be a fabric for the revelation to sit in so that it could be received and held on to. Because before that fabric, before that structure was available, it wouldn't have been able to be held. There had to be a new wineskin to fit the wine. And so God creates the wineskin, and then he drops the wine. He creates the medium, and then he gives the revelation. Well, about 200 years before Christ, I think about 200 years, there's a guy by the name of Alexander the Great. And he takes over the known world. And he decides that the best way to maintain control over these countries is not necessarily by fear, but by economy. And if he can control economy, he can control the nations. And so he creates a standard language so that trade is able to go clear across the empire, and there's a common trade and a common language for it to be. We call it koinonia Greek, common Greek, which was a very common way of communicating. Now, all of a sudden, the possibility of information that's written in one place can actually be understood in another place without somebody from this place explaining it. And right after that, Jesus comes, and he calls himself the Word. So we have a major shift going from pictures and stories into written language, and there's a revelation of God. We have a shift of a common language that goes around the known world, and you have the uttermost ends of the earth was a common phrase in both the Greek and the Roman Empire. The Romans just inherited what the Greek built. They took it over and kind of used the structure that was already there because it worked so well. And they took it. And so the known world, the ends of the world for them was the ends of the Roman Empire. And because there was a common language, what was being written, we call the New Testament, was able to spread. And somebody named Paul was actually able to go to all these places because he didn't have to have translations in all these places because every city had its own language like it used to be. Now they have a common tongue that they understand, at least the educated would understand, and they would have a place, and a new message is able to be released. But still, the average person did not know how to read. The average person still learned through pictures. And so the theology and the understanding of God that was developed in the church was based upon pictures. And we call it icons. It's why in the traditional churches, in the Roman Catholic churches, in the cathedrals, that there was so much art, there were so many pictures, and there were so many statues. They were not intended as idols. It was the only gospel that the average person would ever be able to understand because they couldn't read. They weren't taught how to read. They didn't have the capacity because that hadn't been a common thing. And so they had pictures. And so the experience and the understanding of God was this corporate gathering around a corporate experience that allowed people to come into something where they encountered God. And theology was built around that because that was the normal way that they learned, because that's what their capacity was. Now let's fast forward about 1,500 years. There's a new invention that comes on the scene. The printing press. Now all of a sudden you can mass produce, and average people are starting to learn, because instead of a book having to be hand copied by a scribe, imagine how much time that would be. Let's just pay them minimum wage. Now you realize that an average farmer would never be able to purchase a scroll. Only the rich had scrolls. Because it was a tedious, long process. Only the educated would even know what they were doing. Now all of a sudden there's common, it's able to go everywhere. And there's this thing that happens where God begins to release a new revelation. And that new theology comes in the time of the printing press, because now people have the ability to understand something because they're being taught that way. It had actually created a structure in their understanding for that to come into. Now this is leading into something that's important for us today. I'm giving you some context so you can see something, because if we don't understand this, we're going to miss the season that we're in. That's the reason why the Reformation had such impact. But what happened is this new wine had to come into new wineskins, but the old wine didn't understand it. They rejected one another. And so the old wineskin, the Catholic Church, where there was a group that is educated, that has a beautiful knowledge of God, the average person, it's a cultural, corporate experience. It's about belonging to a group. That still is there. That still is going on. That theology that was absolutely accurate, that was given to them based on their ability to understand, it was accurate but not complete. When the new theology comes, the new wineskin begins to throw out the old wineskin, because it can no longer see the way that was able to see, because they've learned in a different way and they couldn't understand what was being given in that way. And so it maintains its history, it maintains its place, but there's something new that's being given. And now it becomes about understanding. It becomes about this thought process, and it becomes about this personal thing. Because you no longer have to go to a corporate gathering for there to be a public reading and a public experience for you to encounter God. You can read the Bible for yourself. And the idea of an individual salvation, which was true before, and it was there, but it just wasn't a thing. Now it becomes a major thing, because that's a major thing. Because how do you learn? By reading a book. Well, most of your reading of a book is something that you do. And so your mindset is, I'm learning something for me. And so we begin to think of the Bible as me learning something for me. And we not only did that, but we also took our churches and we reformatted them so that they look like a book. 2 rows with lines on either side. Because we began to, what? Because we'd been taught, we have a mindset that's based on a book, and so we create a theology that's based on a book, and we create our understanding and our experience of God that's based on a book, because that's how our minds are formed. That's the wineskin that we have. Now fast forward about 400 years, and you have the advent of something, and they came on the tails of one another. Radio and TV. At radio and TV. All of a sudden, you have something being broadcast from outside that people are able to individually experience, and yet it's somebody else that's communicating it. It's not their own grabbing hold of it, but they're getting the experience, that individual experience, through a singular vessel. And it becomes about the showmanship, and it becomes about the demonstration and the presentation, and all of a sudden theology begins to shift. And it's in that period of time that we have what we call the Pentecostal outpouring. And the Pentecostal church, and then the charismatic church, Pentecostal in the advent of the radio, charismatic in the advent of the TV being popularized. As those two things, as those two mediums came, those two understandings of God and experiences of God. Why? Were they true before? Of course they were true before. Were there people experiencing it before? Of course there were people experiencing it before, but now it becomes widespread because the average person's brain has now been formatted to be able to receive information in that way. Is this making sense? Every time this happens, those that step into the new, they begin to separate from the old. Not everybody, because there's always crossover, but there's that general split that happens. And we now have this man or this woman that stands on a stage, and everybody comes to experience the show. And we start thinking of our Christianity, of our experience of God through that lens. And it becomes about the experience that I have through somebody else's presentation. And we start to create the culture and the theology that we've all become familiar with. And this is where most of us have grown up. Now, I don't think that there's anybody in the room, maybe one or two. How many of you were born after the invention of social media? Nobody. We are in the middle of the next shift right now. And if the church doesn't shift, we're going to lose a generation. Not because we will lose the generation. They are being taught in a new way. They're taught interaction. They're taught constant, my own opinion, my own experience. And there's something that is good in it, and there's something that's bad in it. Just like every media change that has ever happened in the past. But we're in a season where God is about ready to pour out a new revelation, another piece of who he is for those that have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. But most of those have been trained how to think based off of a new medium where it's about these interactive, on-demand experiences where everybody has an opinion and everybody is able to bring something and do something. And if we don't start rethinking how we do church, we will be the last wineskin. We'll be the Catholic Church to the evangelical church. We'll be the evangelical church to the Pentecostal church to the charismatic church. And there will be some that will honor all that God has done in the past. But that's not our problem. Because that's not us. My problem is, will I be able to step into the new thing when God pours it out? That's why I care. Will you be able to step into the new thing? Will you allow yourself to actually think differently so that you can step into what God is about to do? Where he's been preparing a generation, and we have people in our churches that don't understand our current format of church and the way that it happens because their minds have been formed differently because they're learning differently. It doesn't make sense to them. It makes perfect sense to us, but it doesn't make sense to them. And they're going to have to reinvent it, and it's going to be new wine. Which means it's not going to be mature, which means it's going to have issues. But will we make room for it in the house so that we then have something that gets handed off to the next generation and we don't miss out on the new revelation of himself that God is about ready and is already starting to give? Is this making sense? So we start talking about spiritual creativity. There's pieces, because God's been trying to prepare us for a shift in thinking. He's been trying to prepare the church, but will we allow it to take us the full gambit so that we actually see the big picture of what it is that God's doing and take it beyond? Now, it has to be more than neat little boxes with vanilla walls. Because that does not communicate the glory and the beauty of God. So we've left the old. There was an inheritance that we've been given as a church from monuments to the glory of God, that people would come from miles around. People that didn't know God, they would come and they would be struck by His glory and His beauty because they experienced something. Because someone was willing to pay Michelangelo to lay on his back for, what was it, a decade or something like that, so he could paint the Sistine Chapel. But we're not willing to put our money into beauty. Why? We've been taught from a book. We've been taught from TV. And we've judged the TV because most of us were educated by those that were still in the book. You can't throw out the book. But will we continue to move with what God is doing? Are you seeing this, the need for this? Now, does that mean that next Sunday you got to have a whole new format of church? Not necessarily, but some of you, God has been prompting you to do something and you haven't had the guts to do it yet. Because you're afraid you're going to lose people. Guess what? You're going to lose people. You're going to lose people if you do it. You're going to lose people if you don't. You're going to get people as long as you do what God wants you to do. You can't make people happy, so stop trying. Remember last night? Why do we continue to allow the fear of man to keep us shackled to tradition? Dead tradition that's not carrying us forward. Let's let God and the desire to go after His heart allow us to try something new, try something different so that we can step into the season. And some of us are going to step into it, and some of us aren't going to step into it. And then we get to deal with the real issues where we want everybody to be like us, and those that don't step into it begin judging those that did, saying, oh, look, they're getting weird, they've gone off the rails, they've done this. And those that are stepping into it judge the people that didn't, and say, look, oh, how dead they are, how traditional they are, they're so stuck in their mindsets. But you cannot do that if you want the old and the new to grow up together. And I haven't had this conversation with Michael, but I know Michael well enough that his heart for Patria is that this isn't something, family isn't something that is one generation and never has kids and never moves on. It's supposed to grow. It's supposed to continue. It's supposed to be generational. And there's supposed to be a shift and there's supposed to be a move. But if you don't take a risk according to the faith that you have, you'll never teach your kids, the kids in your church and the kids in your home, how to take a risk for what God has put in you. Your ability to respond is key to understanding and to them being able to have the courage to do it. If you will take the risk, they will think it's normal to take the risk. If you make it a lifestyle and you pay the price, they won't have to fight the battle. But whatever battle you decide you're not going to fight, your kids will get to fight for you. Whatever battle you decide that you're going to back down from and you're not going to go there, you will leave for the following generations. You ever read Judges? You ever take a look at the cities that Israel did not conquer? Because it was too hard? It's called the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Because the battles you don't fight, your kids will. We get to fight this battle. We get to fight the battle of our own heart to say yes to taking a risk, because that's what faith is. Allowing something new to rise up inside of us and pursuing it no matter what the cost, because we're doing it the most important, we're doing it for him because he has a dream in his heart for you. He has a dream in his heart for your church, for your ministry, for your body, for your business, for your family. He's got something in his heart that he's seen, that he's been holding there from eternity past until now. Will you fulfill that dream? And 2, your breakthrough becomes an open door that others don't have to pay the price that you paid. I mean, we are all standing in a breakthrough that woman and her husband paid for us to stand in. I want to leave a legacy like that for the next generation. Father, I'm asking that you would give us courage to say yes. Lord, that in this shift, as you're beginning to change things and you're calling people up that think differently and see differently, would we be ones that cheer them on? Would we be ones that would use the wisdom that we're given not to quench, but to provide a platform so that they can grow, so that they can have the opportunity to mature, and they can become the old wine for their generation? Father, would you forgive us where we've judged the new wine, and would you forgive us where we've judged the old wine? Father, we've judged you, and we thought we were judging people. Lord, would you forgive us? We repent. And we ask that the blood of the cross would come and would begin to sear off the reaping of our judgment, so that it would no longer affect our ability to step out in faith, and it would no longer affect our ability to celebrate what you're doing that's different than what you've done in us. Lord, we say yes to you. We say yes to the invitation. And whatever our role is, would you give us the strength to obey? Even when it's different, even when it doesn't make sense, in the little and in the big. Because we want to be the ones that fulfill your dream. In Jesus' name. Amen. So, Michael, do you want me to wrap it, or are you going to wrap it? I wrap it. All right, guys, go get dinner. It's time. We'll be back here at 7. Bless you guys.